Good morning, everyone. I assume you can hear me okay. My name's Kurt, coming to you from Rockville, Maryland. And this morning I want to talk about a guy named Chinul. Chinul. He lived about 800 years ago, a little over 800 years ago in Korea. He was a Buddhist teacher, generally considered to be one of the most important teachers in the history of Korean Buddhism. And certainly someone whose teachings have influenced me and inspired me and informed my practice. One of the things that he left behind was a fairly short written set of instructions for beginners. And I just want to read a little selection from that. There's a couple of different translations of this, and this is really more of a paraphrase than a translation, although most, yeah. But here's what Chinul said. He said, "You must be conscientious about your practice in the morning and the evening, and view your own laziness with disdain. You should know the proper forms to follow so that you do not create a disturbance. When chanting, you should recite the text while considering the meaning. Do not simply follow the pronunciation, and do not sing out of key. When gazing reverently at sacred images, do not let your mind wander. You must understand that your own karmic obstructions are as vast as mountains and oceans, but they can all be dissolved if you practice with the correct understanding and following the correct forms. Deeply contemplate the fact that both you and the Buddha have the same true nature, and that you are both in accord with dependent arising. You should have deep faith that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas always respond to your practice, just as shadows follow form and echoes follow sound." So he hits on several different important points, and sometimes he gets down into details like don't sing out of key when you're chanting, which is easier said than done. But so what does something like that mean? What does it mean when a teacher says don't sing out of key when you're chanting? It means pay attention. So Zen Master Sung San taught when you're chanting, you should listen to your own voice. You should listen to the voice of each of the other people who are chanting with you, and you should listen to the voice. You should listen to the voice that everyone creates together. And so, if you're doing that, then you're trying. You're doing your best, and you're trying to chant along with everyone else. Chanting out of key means chanting in the same key that everyone else is chanting, right? What is the correct key? The correct key is the key that everyone is chanting in together. And so people who have a musical training of any kind are often, I don't know if you can hear, there's a trash truck going by outside. But people who have musical training are sometimes kind of driven crazy by chanting, because the vast majority of people who are chanting in any group of people who are chanting together don't have any musical training at all, and some people will even try to use like a pitch pipe or some other means to say, okay, here's the key we're going to be chanting in. But anyway, so that's just one little thing in what Chinul says. I'm gonna read this again, because what Chinul has to say is probably better than anything that I'm going to add to it. So here's Chinul from his advice for beginners. You must be conscientious about your practice in the morning and the evening, and view your own laziness with disdain. You should know the proper forms to follow so that you do not create a disturbance. When chanting, you should recite the text while considering the meaning. Do not simply follow the pronunciation, and do not sing out of key. When gazing reverently at sacred images, do not let your mind wander. You must understand that your karmic obstructions are as vast as mountains and oceans, but they can all be dissolved if you practice with the correct understanding and following the correct forms. Deeply contemplate the fact that both you and the Buddha have the same true nature, and that you are both in accord with dependent arising. You should have deep faith that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas always respond to your practice, just as shadows follow form, and echoes follow sound. So one thing that's kind of interesting to pick up on in what Chinul is saying in this is the idea that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas respond to our practice. So Chinul makes a couple of references here to following forms, and if you're doing chanting, you have to know the chants, but you not just knowing how the chants are pronounced, but what they mean. If you're practicing together with others, you should know the forms to follow so that you don't create disturbances. But even even if you're practicing by yourself, it's important to have a form that you follow, so that you don't create a disturbance even in your own practice. Because if you're unclear about what to do when in your practice, then it creates a disturbance in your own practice. But one of the forms that's followed in Korean Buddhism, and not just in Korean Buddhism, but in Buddhism generally, is, although there are different forms for it, depending upon what precise tradition or style that you practice in, is what kind of practice do you do when someone has died? And so there's different practices that are done when a person has died, but a very common practice is to chant the name of the Bodhisattva. Jijang Bosal is the name of the Bodhisattva, and the name of the Bodhisattva whose job it is to help people during the transition from one lifetime to the next. And so if you chant Jijang Bosal, so if you're not familiar with Jijang Bosal chanting, it's very simple. You just chant Jijang Bosal over and over again. And if you're familiar with Jijang Bosal chanting, or possibly with Kwanseum Bosal chanting, then you might know that there's a little tune that you can use while you're chanting. Jijang Bosal, 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 Jijang Bosal. And so that's the tune that Zen Master Sung San taught. It's the same tune that you can use for Kwanseum Bosal chanting. Quan Sambo Sal, 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 Quan Sambo Sal. I'm always in great danger of violating Chinul's admonition to not sing out of tune, but I do my best. And I've gotten a little better over the years, actually. So when you chant Jijang Bosal, one of Chinul's admonitions is to not just follow the pronunciation, but to, how does he put it? Consider the meaning. And so what is the meaning of chanting Jijang Bosal for someone who has died? And it's a bit of a tricky issue, but it's tricky for modern Western Buddhists. It's not particularly tricky for, historically speaking, for Buddhists. So the meaning of chanting Jijang Bosal for someone who has died is that after you die, there is a transition period between the end of one life and the beginning of the next life. And so this transition period is called the middle existence, which now I can't remember how it's what the correct way of saying it in Korean Buddhism, but many people are familiar with the Tibetan Buddhist term for the same thing, which is just the bardo, B-A-R-D-O, bardo, and that just means middle existence or in between existence, in between one lifetime and the next. And another name for, or another way of understanding the bardo existence or the middle existence is it's the time when you don't have a body. And this transition period can be very difficult. And so the meaning of chanting Jijang Bosal is asking Jijang Bosal to help the person who has died during this transition period. So I said, this is a little tricky, especially for modern Western Buddhists, because there are three rather thorny issues that are raised. And these are not necessarily issues to, well, the three issues, the three questions are: is this what really happens? Does anything like this actually happen? Is there some existence that we have when after our body dies? And another related question is: does chanting to or praying to a bodhisattva do anything? Is it possible to help someone who is going through this transition period? And is our chanting to Jijang Bosal, does it help the person who's going through that transition in any way? So that's one question. Is this for real? The second question is this something that the Buddha taught, or is so a common idea that many people have, I would say mistakenly, is that this is just some stuff that people added later on, that the Buddha didn't really teach anything about, future lives or past lives or the period in between lives. So that's the second question. Is this actually Buddhist teaching? And a third question that can arise, that does arise, is does this have anything to do with Zen? So the reason why this issue arises is that some people take the attitude, okay, well, maybe this is Buddhism, but we are Zen, and so we don't need this Buddhist stuff. So as far as the first question goes, is is this what really happens? Gee, how should I know? I think it's very reasonable to say that we don't know. Both of my parents have been dead for many years, and I still have a very strong sense of their presence. One way that I have a strong sense of their presence is that they show up all the time in my dreams, and it's never until after I wake up that I think, oh, my mom and dad are dead, but I just was with them in my dreams. When I see them in my dreams, they're still alive, still with me. And so, what is that? On the one hand, you can say, well, it's just a dream. But on the other hand, it points to something that's quite true and quite real, is that regardless of what we think about whether or not there is any such thing as an afterlife or any such thing as a continued existence after this body dies, one thing we know for sure is that our relationships don't end. My mom, there's you might have just heard the brakes of one of the trash trucks squeaking in the background. I don't know if you heard that or not. I heard it pretty loudly. But my mom is still my mom. My dad is still my dad. That relationship doesn't end just because my dad's body is no longer here and my mom's body is no longer here. So it's very clear that the relationship is still there. And in fact, the Buddha, okay, so enough with the first question. Is this true? I don't know. Do people really go through a transition period from one lifetime to the next? And then after some period of time, then they go on to their next lifetime? I don't know. But did the Buddha teach this? And the answer to that is pretty clear. The Buddha, in every tradition of Buddhism, including all the various schools of Zen, all accept the basic, the same basic story of the Buddha's enlightenment. And on the night when the Buddha attained enlightenment, there were several things that happened. One was that he gained a complete knowledge of all of his past lives. And throughout the rest of his life, throughout the rest of the Buddha's life, he would frequently refer to his own past lives. Except he would never talk about just his own past life. Whenever the Buddha recalled and recounted for his students one of his own past lives, it would always be in the presence of other people who were also there in that past life story that he would tell. So he would tell some story, and often these, actually the Buddha's past life stories seem to actually have some relationship with Aesop's fables. Many of them are very similar, and in many of the Buddha's past life stories, he and the other people in the past lives are different animals. So at the end of the story, after the Buddha would tell one of these past life stories, then he would go around to the people who were there listening, and he would say, now in that story, you were the rabbit, and you were the tiger, and etc. And then he would say, and I was in one story, he was a clump of grass. I think in that story, he was a clump of grass, and Ananda was a big tree that the clump of grass was next to. And so, really, the past life stories that the Buddha told were always stories about relationships that continue on from one lifetime to the next. Um, and so you can there's a great book by a guy named, I think his name is Richard Gombrich, who's a great Buddhist scholar who does not himself believe in uh, rebirth or reincarnation or past lives or future lives. Um, but he did quite a bit of research on the earliest known teachings of the Buddha. And in his book, it's called What the Buddha Thought. Not to be confused, there's another book called What the Buddha Taught. But this is a book called What the Buddha Thought. And he goes into this whole question of, whether or not the Buddha actually taught about rebirth. And he comes to the conclusion that it's pretty clear that he did. Okay, so the last question is, does this have anything to do with Zen? And I would leave that, if you look at the teachings of Zen Master Sung San, would he liked to quote his own poetry, and he once wrote a poem, and I don't remember the whole poem, but the 3 or 4 lines that I do remember is, when you die, what kind of a body will you get? Hurry up, hurry up. I'm probably mangling his poem a little bit. But if you do a Google search, on Sung San, in quotes, and what kind of body, and that poem will come up in many hits. But so Sung San, but if you ever asked Zen Master Sung San, what happens when we die, he'd probably, clobber you over the head. I mean, and quite possibly literally do so. He wasn't big on explanations, but he referred to past lives and future lives in his teachings frequently. And so do what many other Chinul does throughout his teachings. Haku and Dogen, and pretty much any, and I wouldn't say even pretty much, but I would say to a person, all of the great teachers of Zen have made it pretty clear that these teachings on past lives and future lives are part of their teaching of Zen. But that is something, so what? So there's a fourth question. I said the first question is this real? Second question is, did the Buddha teach this? And the third question is, does this have anything to do with Zen? There's a fourth question of, so what? If we can't know for sure, then which we can't, then so what? And that's also a reasonable question. Yeah. So let me just read one more time from Chinul's admonitions. You must be conscientious about your practice in the morning and the evening, and view your own laziness with disdain. You should know the proper forms to follow so that you do not create disturbance. When chanting, you should recite the text while considering the meaning. Do not simply follow the pronunciation, and do not sing out of key. When gazing reverently at sacred images, do not let your mind wander. You must understand that your karmic obstructions are as vast as mountains and oceans, but they can all be dissolved if you practice with the correct understanding and following the correct forms. Deeply contemplate the fact that you and the Buddha have the same true nature, and that you are both in accord with dependent arising. You should have deep faith that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas always respond to your practice, just as shadows follow form and echoes follow sound. Thank you for listening.